Joni has been avoiding the truth, the cameras, and the questions for weeks. According to friends, the recollections of Marcus' last moments have been haunting her. What, though, could be so terrible that she was unable to speak? Joni is now prepared to reveal the curtain after a tense stillness that left everyone wondering. She's about to reveal something more than merely sentimental. This discovery has the potential to alter all of our preconceived notions about that evening. There seemed to be a pause in the Christian world when Marcus Lamb died in November 2021. On social media, word of his passing spread like wildfire. Pastors shared sincere remembrances. People from all around the nation wrote about how much he had inspired them, and Christian networks showed snippets of his most impactful sermons. He wasn't just another televangelist in the eyes of many. He was a combative individual. A man who, particularly during the COVID-19 pandemic, stood up for what he believed in even if it meant standing by himself. The audience of Daystar responded as though they had lost a relative. In their living rooms, viewers sobbed while watching memorial programs. The ministry's friends told tales of Marcus's fearlessness, humor, and generosity. According to the official statement, problems led to his death. Pertaining to COVID-19, it was portrayed as abrupt, unanticipated, and extremely terrible. People were sad. At least in public, the story appeared clear and comprehensive, and they prayed for his family. However, that was the only story that was shown. In the silent corridors of Daystar, behind the cameras, a new mood was emerging. Individuals who had known Marcus, producers, employees, friends in the ministry sensed something was wrong. They were more than merely mourning. They were picking up on little nuances. The public narrative didn't quite align with the facts. Marcus hadn't spent much time in the studio in the weeks prior to his passing, to start. Although his appearance and voice continued to appear in broadcasts, several workers said that they had not seen him in person for some time. Sermons that had been pre-recorded suggested that he was still actively engaged. However, his absence was apparent behind the scenes. Then Joni appeared. She thanked people for their prayers while praising her hubby on television. Off camera, however, some insiders noted her apparent calmness. Not shattered, not broken, but focused and steady. Most people find that losing a spouse so quickly is traumatic blow. However, a few individuals involved felt that she was already in the forward motion. There were whispers. Quiet questions between persons who trusted one another, nothing loud or public. Did anyone realize Marcus had been ill for so long? Were there any red flags? And the most audacious query of all, has Joni already been anticipating and prepared for this moment? She was not being accused of any evil. The tone wasn't that. It was more about a sense that the world wasn't being told the complete truth. That another chapter of the story lay somewhere behind the official declarations and the heartfelt homages. One that included not only loss but also changes in leadership, timing, and Daystar's approach. Worked. As more people shared their suspicions, they became more aware that they weren't the only ones. Similar observations were being made by other employees, even some who did not even work closely together. The ease of the changeover, how quickly choices were made, and how some of Marcus's previously shelved initiatives were approved all at once. Simply labeling it a conspiracy was insufficient. That was not all there was to it. You couldn't unsee it once you saw it, though. The discrepancy between the quiet feelings of insiders and what the public was being fed. And that whole turn became the entrance to a larger, more intricate tale. Because while the outside world witnessed a widow courageously taking on her late husband's role, those within started to question whether she had been wearing them for some time. Didn't begin with a loud statement regarding Joni's diaries. Initially, it was merely a casual remark in the break room or a discreet inquiry over coffee between two employees who had been with Daystar for many years. Do you know about it? It generally started like that. Subsequently, there were subdued whispers and cautious looks over shoulders. The outside world was not the source of this gossip. It came from those who have already near the Lamb family, within the ministry. The rumor was that fragments of Joni Lamb's private journal were making the rounds someplace. Not the entire thing. No, it didn't occur. You couldn't simply download it from the internet. They were scans, photocopies, and a few pages here and there that were passed from one reliable individual to another. They did not include justifications. No one disclosed how they had obtained them, and nobody desired to be the one to reveal them to the world. However, they were so real that several people claimed to have handled them in their hands. Everything was different because of what was in those pages. Grief was expected. They anticipated entries that were characterized by suffering, perplexity, or unadulterated grief over Marcus' illness and passing. But that's not what they have read. The tone was measured, dispassionate, and almost too quiet. Some people said it was frigid, but not in a mean way. It was neither fury nor hate. Distance was the problem. The kind of emotional detachment that takes time to manifest. It develops gradually over months or years in silence. In these entries, Joni did not lose her temper. She made no serious accusations against Marcus. There was no discussion of treachery, no dramatic admissions, but what was there? To put it briefly, nearly cut phrases depicted a marriage that didn't look like it did on film. She characterized their house as being incredibly silent. She wrote that he was no longer paying attention. Not to anyone, but to me. The breakup narrative wasn't particularly dramatic. It was the gradual separation of two individuals who had previously stood side by side on some of the largest Christian stages in the world. Then followed the line that became ingrained in everyone's memory. Days before Marcus was admitted to the hospital, the entry was made. She had written in her own handwriting. "Everything is coming into view now. I just have to stay quiet. Let it unfold. God sees." To someone who is not involved in the scenario, that would seem innocuous, even spiritual, like something you might read in a devotional. However, it didn't read that way to those who had witnessed the true nature of Marcus and Joni's relationship. It sounded to them like a woman who had previously embraced the inevitable. Someone who, before anything had really transpired, had emotionally moved on. Someone who merely awaited the conclusion. That is why the sequence of events following Marcus's passing felt so odd. Joni portrayed the devoted widow in public, sharing memories, thanking people for their prayers, and sustaining the ministry. However, she was moving in secret. Swiftly. They were holding meetings. Projects that Marcus had put on hold abruptly resumed. Changes in leadership were occurring almost immediately. And everything began to make sense in a way that made people nervous after reading those journal pages, particularly that one terrifying entry. The haste with which Joni made decisions following his death didn't appear to be a response to tragedy if she had already anticipated it. It appeared to be the next phase of a procedure she had previously considered. Joni never responded to the diary, of course. She did not verify it. She didn't dispute it. She never even acknowledged its existence in public. The voices simply became louder in that silence. In secret, people continued to pass those pages. Additionally, each time anew. They had a slightly different perspective on the narrative after reading them. It's worth noting that nobody who saw the diary said she wanted Marcus to leave. They didn't read it that way. The feeling that she had already exceeded some sort of emotional boundary and was subtly leaving the position of wife to pursue something else was what unnerved them. When staff members later went back, they discovered that Marcus had begun making connections between previously unnoticed dots. Joni's poise in meetings, her willingness to take charge, and the way she confidently discussed Daystar's future. She didn't seem to be motivated by grief, even when the ministry was still in mourning. It had a plan, direction, and purpose. The diary evolved beyond being a personal diary. It evolved into a sort of prism that viewers used to rewatch. Marcus's last few weeks of life. After reading those words, everything changed, including the smiles on camera, the composed voice, and the quick decisions. Now everything is becoming clear. I simply must remain silent. Let it happen. God sees. Because of this, the diary is still discussed in whispers years later. It involved more than simply paper and ink. It was an insight into what some people think was the woman at the center of it all's true mental state. And it's difficult to return to the version of the narrative that was presented to the public after seeing that side. People within Daystar started to notice the change before the funeral was even over. From the outside, everything appeared to be just as it should have been following the unexpected passing of a significant figure like Marcus Lamb. On-air tributes, tender. The studio was decked out with flowers, and music was playing beneath his past sermons. The people witnessed sadness and a ministry. However, if you were present at the meetings or in the premises, you were aware that something else was going on. Decisions had always been made by Marcus. Without his consent, nothing moved. Not a topic in a broadcast, not a guest on a show, not even minor adjustments to the set design. His grip was firm and his vision was clear. People therefore believed that it would take some time for the ministry to decide what to do after his death. Grief slows down the pace of life. It takes longer to make decisions. Transitions to leadership are typically accompanied by hesitancy. Here, that did not occur. Instead of withdrawing into a peaceful office, Joni closed the door and rested for a while. She assumed the chair at the head of the table and moved directly into the center of authority. Almost instantly, meetings were set up. Big decisions were being made. Suddenly, Marcus was getting approval for projects that he had put on hold for months or even years. The budgets changed. The positions of leadership were transferred. Some employees were abruptly transferred to entirely different departments. Others were informed that their jobs were no longer available. The speed was not the only thing that attracted attention. It was her seeming readiness. There was no confusion, no stumbling for direction. Joni was prepared with responses to all inquiries, schedules for each project, and a future vision for the network. Proceed. Some others thought she had been preparing this for some time. There was also the legal aspect. The processing of estate documents was completed shortly. Transfers of property were completed quickly. Daystar's financial and material possessions were easily transferred under Joni's control. Usually, it takes weeks or even months to resolve these kinds of changes. It took place here within days. It was both stunning and unnerving to those who saw. Some made an effort to defend it. Some employees suggested that she might be keeping herself occupied in order to cope. Perhaps she doesn't want to spend her days sitting around sobbing. Others, however, couldn't deny the sense that this was more than a matter of staying busy. This appeared to be someone taking on a role she had mentally practiced already. At this point, a different name began to appear in discussions. Dr. Doug Weiss. He had seen Christian television before. He had previously been seen by viewers discussing marriage, relationships, and recovery on Daystar. His style, voice, and look were all familiar to the staff. His presence didn't appear out of the ordinary at first. People quickly realized, however, that he wasn't merely there to record a segment. He participated in the large sessions that reviewed leadership changes, financial plans, and programming decisions. Nor was he seated quietly in the rear. Joni was listening to him as he spoke out and offered suggestions. Pay attention. They appeared at ease in each other's company. In between sessions, they would converse in the hallway, occasionally with their heads buried and their voices quiet. Nothing was blatantly improper, and there was nothing that anyone could use as evidence of anything other than friendship or business cooperation. However, many couldn't help but notice because of the proximity and the timing. Marcus had been dead for less than a month. Employees continued to pass while still grieving his office, anticipating his presence there. Nevertheless, Joni heard a fresh perspective that helped mold the ministry's destiny. This was merely feasible for some. Advisors are essential for any leader, and Joni was tasked with a great deal of responsibility. Others, however, saw it as yet another indication that this time had been expected. Dr. Weiss's quick involvement made it seem less like an impromptu choice and more like a part of an already moving plan. The alterations continued as the weeks passed. Those who had worked with Marcus for more than 10 years and were his most trusted team members began to leave the building. A few were surreptitiously released. No goodbye celebrations, no public pronouncements. Others said the ministry no longer felt the same and departed on their own. New faces and positions were switched. Emerged, and Daystar's structure was altered in ways Marcus would not have likely recognized. The response was consistent whether someone asked about the rate or course of these changes. Don't worry, Joni is mourning her own way. Say a prayer for her. Nevertheless, staff members did not discuss sadness in private. They focused on her seeming confidence, how prepared, how everything she did seemed to follow a plan she had hidden away, just waiting to be used. And the entry about keeping silent and letting things happen came out when the rumors about the journal began to spread. This abrupt change in appearance seemed different. It no longer appeared to be a lady compelled by tragedy to assume a leadership role. The woman seems to have already pictured herself in that position. Who, before the rest of the world realized it was coming, had already taken a few steps down that route in her head. It was unable to determine the exact origins of this preparation or whether it was a deliberate move or rather a normal reaction to a challenging marriage. However, the message was obvious to those who had worked under Marcus for years. Marcus was no longer connected to Daystar. Now that it was Joni's, she wasn't wasting any. Secondly, she stamped it. It was all the more remarkable because it appeared so natural. There were swift, definitive actions instead of protracted hesitations, as though Marcus's passing wasn't the beginning of something new but rather the last phase of a process that had subtly started much earlier. It wasn't simply how fast Joni assumed leadership following Marcus's death that made an impression on people. She seemed so prepared. When someone has recently lost their spouse, you expect to see a particular expression on their face. You can typically see the shock in their eyes, even if they make an effort to remain composed. The uneasiness that results from suddenly bearing a burden they didn't choose to wear, the way they pause before making judgments. However, that was not Joni's appearance. She moved throughout the first week following Marcus's passing with a sense of exceptional certainty. Decisions were made without lengthy delays. There was no indication that she required more time to consider the situation. She was aware of which initiatives would proceed, which would be abandoned, and which individuals would remain or depart. She worked just as quickly on legal topics. Control of Daystar's assets, estate transfers, and ownership paperwork were all handled nearly right away. It was remarkable to some. The hallmark of a capable leader who could maintain the ministry's stability during a challenging time. Others, however, found it to be unsettling. Had she not planned part of it beforehand, how could she move so quickly? At that point, the notion of readiness evolved beyond merely praising her leadership. It turned into a cause for mistrust. The employees who had known Marcus for years were aware of his strict network management. They were aware that he preferred to participate in all significant choices, particularly those pertaining to finances and leadership. When the dust settled, people began to wonder if Marcus had known about the plans that were put into action after his passing. Or did he not contribute to the design of these changes? As they considered it further, the more the timing was notable. Some of the restructure didn't appear like it was put together at the last minute, it felt too planned. Big decisions like redistributing leadership responsibilities or resuming long-suspended initiatives typically take months of planning, as anybody who has ever worked in a large organization knows. But those shifts took place here in a matter of days. The diary was the next item. For those who. It was quite hard to overlook the connection after seeing those released documents. Everything is starting to make sense now, that one entry. I simply must remain silent. Let it happen. The weight of God sees increased significantly. If you don't have the diary, you can attribute her speed to willpower or a need to keep occupied. However, along with it, the parts began to came together in a manner that seemed prearranged. Not that anyone thought Joni was responsible for Marcus's demise. The conversation didn't even touch on that idea. The thought that she had already emotionally entered a future without him and possibly even laid out the initial steps of that future before it ever occurred was what unnerved people. The more they thought about her, the more suspicious they became. Manner. Despite her sadness, she spoke softly about Marcus' legacy while smiling in public. In private, she was more incisive, straightforward, and intent on directing the ministry's future. Waiting for the ideal moment to make significant adjustments made little sense. She went swiftly, as though the appropriate moment had already passed. And there was more. The coming of Dr. Weiss, Doug. His unexpected attendance at strategy sessions raised questions about how long he had been a member of her inner circle. Had he been counseling her previously, or had he been called in following Marcus's passing? The preparation picture became even more obvious if it was the latter. A reliable advisor on hand, prepared to support her during a change that appeared to occur spontaneously. The rapidity of legal filings, the promptness of leadership transitions, and the ease of working with a new advisor all started to feel like parts of a larger whole. Even though the entire image was hidden from the outside, people inside Daystar began drawing their own judgments. For some, the solution was straightforward. Joni had been aware of Marcus's precarious health and had mentally prepared herself for the possibility. Others found it more profound. They felt that she had already seen a different future for Daystar without Marcus, one that differed from the ministry he had established, and that she was prepared to realize that vision as soon as the chance presented itself. The issue was that Joni never discussed it. She made no mention of the modification's timing. She did not elaborate on the reasoning behind some of the choices. Her so rapidly, and she remained silent about the diary's rumors. A void was created by the quiet, and conjecture flourished there. Individuals were the observations of individuals who had been there, who had seen the ministry shift virtually overnight. They also couldn't get rid of the impression that Johnny's leadership hadn't begun with Marcus's passing, regardless of how well-produced the broadcasts were or how motivational the public statements were. It was only the instant that got formally recognized. The unsolved questions eventually formed a part of the narrative. Not the one that was broadcast, but the one that was whispered over the phone, in private chats, and in meetings held behind closed doors. What was Marcus aware of during those last weeks? Was he aware of the impending change? Was the diary read by him? Had they ever discussed what might occur if he was gone, to Daystar? Those were questions no one could definitively answer. Perhaps the reason they persist is that the truth, whatever it is still hidden away in the same location as the other parts of the story that no one has shared. For those who experienced it, that is ultimately what makes this chapter so eerie. It goes beyond what occurred. It concerns the perception that some before anyone outside the inner circle even realized change was imminent, a portion of it had already been put into motion. It also has to do with the stillness that still permeates those times. A quiet that could be maintaining. The actual tale from the beginning outside the inner circle even realized change was imminent, a portion of it had already been put into motion. It also has to do with the stillness that still permeates those times. A quiet that could be maintaining. The actual tale from the beginning.